One of my first videos on this channel was about guns and how we weren't as divided as gun violence as we thought. And the main thesis of that video was basically the idea that, common sense gun reform was something that most Americans would agree with, but because of politics and, special interest groups such as the NRA, things have remained more divided as possible. But today in one of my lectures, I received a guest appearance from a historian named Randolph Roth, who is a very profound thinker and historian and is leading the charge, arguably, for topics of gun policy and, the history of gun culture and gun violence in America and the world even. But he hit on a lot of things that I felt like I should share with you because I think that they're very important and they clear a lot of myths or common tropes that a lot of people use to justify their perspective on the whole gun violence debate. Obviously, homicide is a very important topic. You can think about, several school shootings or massacres or tragedies that happen. An interesting fact to start you off in terms of myth busting is that most gun violence in America is actually when someone takes away their own life rather than someone else's, which I found interesting, of course. And, Professor Roth, his whole idea was that it's not really the guns that are a problem. Obviously, over policing and the structure of guns do contribute, but homicide rates are more influenced by social and political structures than just like economic conditions. So then he starts off by talking about colonial America in the 1600s. You have low homicide rates in like New England because of a strong community and a stable governance. Um, you know, he threw out a bunch of facts about the idea of your perceptions about your society. For instance, towns and counties and villages named after American heroes tend to have less violent crime rates just based on how people think about, the area that they're in. You know, in colonial America, obviously there were higher homicide rates in the South due to, you know, a weaker law enforcement and the idea of, keeping my slaves and my property. And then moving on to the 19th century, there's a decline. You have a strengthening of legal institutions and a public trust in the government. We are, think about your Andrew Jacksons of the world and whatnot. And you see also that rise of middle class and those religious movements, rebirth or revitalization of Christianity in America, promoting those ideas of nonviolence. But moving forward, after the Civil War, you have this huge spike, with the death of Abraham Lincoln, and the Reconstruction failure leading to the Jim Crow South. You had lynchings and racial terrors and homicide trends. And there you go again with that decline in trust in government and law enforcement. So then moving on to the early 20th century, or 1900s to 1950s-ish, you have an expansion of government legitimacy. You have social programs like FDR's alphabet, soup company, or bureaucracy such as your Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. The list goes on. And, you have a rise in gun technology, police professionalism, and, you see a homicide declines. And you also see a rise in urbanization, people moving towards communities. And, on to the mid 20th century, from 1960s to the 1990s, you see those civil rights struggle, the political assassinations such as MLK and Malcolm X and all these people, RFK, and that kind of leads to this trend of urban unrest, obviously increasing violence, not just gun violence, but violence in general. And you also see a rise in awareness in economic inequality and mass incarceration, not to mention the crack cocaine epidemic and the gang violence epidemic that was charged in the 80s and 90s. So all these things, and you know what, even in the 21st century now, we've seen that homicide rates have actually declined in the early 2000s because of community policing and social reforms. You think of your Obamas of the world, or post 9/11, patriotism. But now we see an uptick in homicides in the 2020s due to political instability and even pandemic related economic stress and social unrest. Think about the Black Lives Matter movements and all these kinds of things. So, beyond economics, what are the causes of homicide? And Professor Roth laid out that when people trust the government, when you have trust in the courts, law enforcement, homicide will naturally fall. And it makes sense, right? If I have trust that the police will do my job, not my job, if the police will do their job, the government will protect us. What's the need to own a gun? What's the need to be violent? You saw actually an uptick in the pandemic. Asians who are not notorious, who are not known rather for carrying firearms, purchasing more and more firearms, as you saw this social unrest of, you know, a lot of Chinese people or people of Asian descent feeling prejudiced against. So if you have high levels of corruption, weak institutions, you're obviously going to see more violence. As with social hierarchies, you need a legitimate hierarchy. That's what Roth argues for. Racial violence in a post-construction South reflect this idea. And family's a big thing too. Having a strong, stable family, fatherlessness, community disintegration, all these sort of things lead to crime spikes. And cultural attitudes, right? If you glorify personal revenge or vigilance, you're going to see that. So, beyond economic factors, you can track and see that, like, the math does indeed add up. It's not just, oh my God. So the idea of, like, what can we learn? Obviously, trust in the government and fair and law enforcement plays a key role. Reducing social fragmentation, targeted criminal justice reform, all of these things can help. And it goes to show that, based on the amount of guns we have in this country, by and large, we should have more gun violence than we do. Why don't we? There's a lot of things for that. That is not to say that having more guns leads to more deaths. Of course they lead to more deaths, but we can see and track these ideas of why people would want to own a gun. Another interesting metric I found is that for the black community, if let's say you have rural to urban, it spikes up. The closer you are to the urban areas, the inner cities, the more likely you are going to experience gun violence and violence in general within the black community. But for the white community, it's the exact opposite. Urban areas of white folks don't see as much crime as rural areas of white folks. So yeah, listen, I think the idea of, the Second Amendment also is one that's very important. Professor Roth walked through the idea that, believe it or not, from the historical perspective, the Second Amendment virtually has nothing to do with the individual right to own a firearm. Forget that the Founding Fathers didn't know that guns would develop into mass damage dealing weapons and automatic guns. They were actually aware. I forgot what the name of the gun was, but there were automatic like guns back in the day. So it has the argument that the Founding Fathers did not intend to have firearms of this magnitude, so we can't account for that. That's out of the question. What is really the reason for the Second Amendment is that idea of having a standing militia, militiamen of, a private citizen-made militia from each state to the Founding Fathers was much more appealing than a national military, a federal government-operated army, and such and so forth. Because you have to think about their perspective, right? You just fled the British, which was an incredibly centralized military that you did not want, a standing army that you just despised because of its tyranny and its tyrannical powers. Additionally, the idea to quote-unquote bear arms. Professor Roth brought up the idea that if you were to, um, say I'm going hunting, are you really say, hey son, can you bear arms and go hunting? It's no, shoot the damn duck. Whereas bearing arms is terminology used in military contexts. Obviously, some of you might watch this and say that I'm a liberal, I'm in a liberal indoctrination center and I'm being propagandized. I'd like to disagree with you. I am mostly pro-gun, um, but I think it is important to understand the historical context. I mean, I'm a big Antonin Scalia fanatic in the sense where I really enjoy reading what he says because it is very different and it's very unique. Not that I say I agree, but it was Antonin Scalia in DC versus Heller that says, bearing arms is something that everyone does. And, historically, you know, the right to keep a gun as promoted by the Second Amendment is a independent right. So there's a lot of back and forth debate, but if there's one key takeaway from this video, I would urge you to keep is the idea that guns in America are one, a culture, and two, we can very much pinpoint why these things happen in terms of violence. Um, saying the argument that we need to ban all guns, this is not obviously the correct thing to say. It's not really the guns themselves that are the problem. And I don't want to fall into that super far right kind of trope of like, oh, it's a mental health issue, this and that. It's more of the idea that, um, Professor Roth has these four. I took a picture. I found it really interesting. So you have four keys to a successful nation built with as minimal homicide as possible, and that's political stability, right? Think of the opposite. Your 1960s, the civil rights movement, political figures getting assassinated, uptick in violence. You need political stability, legitimate social hierarchy, right? You have a post Civil War America, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, that kind of blending of the lines between, the newly freed black men and, white oppressors in the Jim Crow South, that rise in violence. Fellow feeling, right? If you have trust in your government, if you have um, good ideas, good thoughts, good relationships with people around you. I forget who, but someone always asks, I think it was my professor about, how well do you know your neighbors these days? Back in the day, we were all friendly with our neighbors. That also idea of like, as I mentioned earlier in the video, people who live in areas named after American heroes tend to commit less violence. So that idea of vibes and feeling actually makes a big difference. And finally, legitimate government. Um, if you have trust in the government, trust in the policing power, then there's no need yourself to pick up a weapon or store and keep and bear arms. And as long as this video goes, I want to finally point out with the idea that social mobility is I wouldn't say the biggest, but it is one of the best correlations and predictors of gun violence. Um, people who commit crimes, by and large, um, it's that feeling of, I can't get upward in life. I can't move forward. Usually throughout American history, we've had always, most of the time, that your sons, your daughters will do better than you financially. But within the millennial generation ushered in, we find that there is a severe decrease in the idea of social upward mobility. So what I would end off saying, in conclusion, so to speak, and this is not my original thinking, this is echoed by Professor Roth, is the idea that, we can start with maybe common sense gun laws, maybe more restrictions, but if you really want to bring down the idea of gun violence, and I think whether you're on the left or the right, Republican or Democrat, fixing social upward mobility, feelings in the government, trust in the government, all these sort of things, political stability, all these sort of things will contribute, and that's where your structural gun violence comes from. With that being said, I've been rambling on way too much. If you think I'm a indoctrinated liberal, please let me know. If you think I'm indoctrinated conservative, I'd also like to know. I like Scalia and I also like liberal thinkers. What are you going to do about it? All right, thank you for watching.